Good morning, fifth grade. So we are going to go ahead and continue with chapter 3 today, which is lesson 1, the Jamestown colony. And so our essential question is going to be, how did early English settlers cooperate and clash with the Native Americans? Remember, we talked about cooperate yesterday. We said that's getting along and working together. And then clash would be like fight and kind of butt heads. So let's go ahead and continue with our reading here. So let's get here. One page and let's zoom on in. So we have England's first permanent colony in North America. After the failure of Roanoke Colony, England did not attempt another colony until Queen Elizabeth's successor, King James I, came to power. In 1606, he granted a group of merchants called the Virginia Company a charter to establish another colony. In December of 1606, the Virginia Company sent 144 men and boys to establish the colony of Jamestown near the mouth of Chesapeake Bay in what is now the state of Virginia. It was England's first permanent North American colony. Jamestown nearly failed from the start. The location was poorly chosen. The settlers wanted a place that they could easily defend. They also wanted a place with water deep enough to allow ships to anchor near the shore. What they did not consider, however, was that the land was swampy and the water from that part of the James River was salty and dangerous to drink. So before moving on and talking more about the Jamestown colony, let's go ahead and look at the timeline that we have here for the lesson. So it looks like right here, Jamestown is established in 1607. And then in 1612, we have John Rolfe introduces tobacco to the colony. In 1614, we have Pocahontas marries John Rolfe. Then in 1619, we have the House of Burgesses meets for the first time. Enslaved Africans are brought to Jamestown. And then in 1622, we have the Second Powhatan War begins. And this is just a little painting of the settlers that are building Jamestown. Many of the colonists were not prepared for the challenges of Jamestown. Many came from the upper class and were interested in finding treasure. They had little experience or desire to do hard outdoor work such as building or farming. They did not plan to stay permanently, but wanted to find gold and return to England. Their participation did little to help. Also, the 7 men on the council selected to lead the colony were distrustful of one another and did not cooperate well. The poor conditions at Jamestown led to starvation and disease. After 2/3 of the colony had died, Captain John Smith took over as leader. He understood the importance of hard work, especially in survival situation. He required every person to work 4 to 6 hours every day. According to some sources, he told the colonists, "Those who don't work don't eat." His firm leadership saved the colony, but its troubles weren't over yet. The Virginia Company continued to support the colony. It would send supply ships with food, tools, goods for trading, and additional settlers. These ships did not come often, however. The first supply arrived in January of 1608. It carried about 100 new settlers. It was also an all-male colony. The second supply did not come until October of that year. It carried 70 new settlers, including the first 2 women of the colony, Martha Forrest and her maid, Anne Burris. Even after women began to arrive, the gender ratio remained skewed throughout most of the 17th century, meaning that there's many more men than there were women. The social structure posed significant challenges for a society that saw family as a main center of social order, economy, and survival. So, meaning that because there were so many men and so few women, it was hard to actually have that family dynamic that they really actually thrived for. And they cherished that family thing. So, it was hard to actually do that with very few women there. So this is a picture here of a metal chest plate that Jamestown men would have worn in battle. The starving time occurred when Captain John Smith left the colony in 1609, and it nearly collapsed. Tensions with the Powhatan people and lack of leadership caused the majority of the colonists to die of starvation and disease. When the group of settlers who had been shipwrecked in Bermuda reached Jamestown in May of 1610, they found the colony in such poor condition that they considered abandoning it. They received news that more ships bringing supplies and people would be arriving, so they stayed and rebuilt the colony with the survivors. Among the shipwrecked settlers was John Rolfe, who ended up helping to save the colony. Okay, so by looking at this map, it says the Native peoples and the English in 1607. So, in the bold there is a Native American group, so that was their name, and then with the dot and the smaller writing, that was a settlement. So let's look at those English settlements. So remember that first one, that Roanoke, that actually failed. That was down here, and then in relationship up here is where we have Jamestown. Okay, and then you can see some of the different Native American groups that are around: the Powhatan, the Arahatec, the Appomattox. I couldn't say that right, and the Chickasaw. So you can see some of the different Native American groups that were around those settlements. All right, let's go ahead and look at the Jamestown settlement then and now. So here's a picture. It says Jamestown may have looked like this at its peak. And then archaeologists study the remains of old Jamestown. So as the Jamestown colony grew, the original fort was eventually abandoned. Over time, the wood rotted away and the foundations became buried in mud. For a while, the location was forgotten. An archaeologist, William Kelso, eventually found the original location by studying writings left by the colonists. Kelso started the Jamestown Rediscovery Project in 1994. He and others began to uncover, study, and preserve the original fort. Visitors can now visit the site of Jamestown. All right, let's continue on with the relations between the Powhatan and the colonists. In addition to being a salty swamp, the location of Jamestown was also in Powhatan territory. The Powhatan Confederacy was an alliance of about 30 groups. They were led by Chief Wahasanakunk, also called Chief Powhatan. He was an intelligent leader who had been successfully increasing the strength and territory of his people when the colonists arrived. Historians are not sure exactly how many groups Chief Powhatan ruled, but he had thousands of warriors at his command. For the struggling Jamestown colony, the Powhatan could be much needed allies or dangerous enemies. As an experienced soldier, Captain John Smith knew Jamestown could not survive a full force attack from the Powhatan, so he wisely chose to avoid conflict as much as possible. He and Chief Powhatan respected one another. Although there were a few conflicts, the relationship was mostly peaceful, and the Jamestown colony was able to get food through trade with the Powhatan. Unfortunately, Smith was injured in a gunpowder accident. His injury forced him to return to England. Then, in 1618, Chief Powhatan died. Power passed to one of his brothers, who ruled briefly before passing the title again to another brother named Open Chankunoff. He was angry about the growth of Jamestown colony into native lands, and he waged wars against the colony for the next several decades. So a decade is 10 years. So over 20, 30 years, he was waging wars against the Jamestown colony. So this is when they were getting along, the colonists traded with the Powhatan for food. So what made it possible for the colonists to trade with the Powhatan? Okay, so who actually helped the Powhatan to be able to trade with the colonists? Look back right here in this paragraph, okay? Now let's go ahead and continue on with a quick biography about the real story of Pocahontas. So the most famous story about Jamestown and the Powhatan is the story about Chief Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas. Her real name was Matoka. Pocahontas was her nickname and meant the playful one. According to legend, when she was around 13 years old, her father captured Captain John Smith and planned to execute him. Pocahontas saved Smith's life by convincing Powhatan to let him go. So this says Pocahontas saving John Smith. There's a picture here. Historians are uncertain if these events happened at all. Captain Smith was known to exaggerate stories. Some historians suggest that the incident was not an attempted execution and that Smith misunderstood a ceremony, making him a sub-chief under Powhatan. What is more certain is that Pocahontas was curious and friendly towards the colonists. This improved relations between the two groups. She later married John Rolfe, a successful Jamestown farmer. This marriage brought peace between the settlers and the Powhatan, who had been growing more hostile since Captain Smith's return to England. Pocahontas died of illness in 1617 while visiting England with her husband. And there's a picture of Pocahontas. And do you think that looks more like her Native American garb, like her Native American outfit, or her English European outfit? Which one do you think? All right, so we have the legacy of the colony. In 1612, John Rolfe introduced a new form of tobacco to the colony. It grew well in Virginia and quickly became a cash crop, meaning that they could make a lot of money off of it. The colony would grow in population and size due to the wealth gained from the new crop. Unfortunately, tobacco is hard on the soil, and so the colonists needed more and more land to grow it. This caused conflicts with the Powhatan and was one of the reasons for the Powhatan Wars. The value of tobacco, however, made the colonies strong and the colonists wealthy enough to protect themselves. Tobacco required a lot of labor, so indentured servants were brought from England to work. Their employers paid for them to travel there, and the indentured servants worked under contract for 5 to 7 years until they repaid their debt. The colonists wanted even more expansion, however, and eventually began purchasing enslaved Africans to work on tobacco farms. So indentured servants are somebody that owes a debt to somebody, so these people would have paid for them to then come over to North America, come over to this colony to work until they pay their debt off, and then they could become free after about 5 to 7 years. When that wasn't working well enough, the colonists needed more people and more people, so that's when they started to purchase enslaved Africans to come and work on their tobacco farms. And this would be a picture of tobacco farming here. Okay, so again, another picture about slavery in the English colonies began in the early 1600s. So this means that the cruel practice of slavery in North America has its roots in England's first permanent colony. The slave trade had already been established by other countries, and in 1619, a Dutch ship entered the port of Jamestown carrying enslaved Africans. 20 of them were exchanged for food. Since slavery had not yet been established in the colony, these first Africans may have been treated more like indentured servants. Records at the time listed them as servants, not slaves. Some apparently gained freedom after working for a certain number of years. The situation would not last. As the contracts on indentured servants ended and the demand for tobacco and other crops grew, planters needed more workers. Some planters attempted to enslave the Native Americans, since the relationship had become much worse after the departure of Captain John Smith and the death of Chief Powhatan. The Native Americans knew the land well and had friends and family to help them, so attempts to enslave them were unsuccessful. Enslaved Africans, however, did not have the same networks of friends or family in the unfamiliar land of North America. Escaping was more difficult. By 1650, the number of enslaved Africans in the Virginia colony had grown to about 300, which doesn't seem like much. I mean, it's a lot, but it's going to end up being a lot more. Another important legacy of Jamestown was the first representative government set up by Europeans in the Americas. In 1619, the Virginia Company had the colonists establish their own government, the House of Burgesses. By this time, the Virginia colony had expanded into 11 settlements. Each was allowed to elect 2 representatives, or burgesses, to speak for them when the House met in Jamestown. Since most of the burgesses were wealthy, white tobacco growers, one of their first laws was simply to settle the price of tobacco. So this is the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg, Virginia. There's a picture of it there. The House of Burgesses had been around for only 5 years when King James took control of the colony from the Virginia Company. The company had been losing money, and the increasing attacks by the Powhatan led Chief Opunchakanow made King James think the colony needed more direct control. He sent royal governors to represent him in leading the colony. Despite this, the House of Burgesses continued to meet every year. Even if the Burgesses were no longer in control, they liked being able to discuss what needed to be done to be united when dealing with the royal government. Jamestown remained the capital of Virginia colony until 1699, after the state house burned down. By this time, many of the people had moved to other settlements, so they decided to rebuild in a better location. Williamsburg became the new capital, and Jamestown was eventually abandoned. All right, so let's go ahead and look at this stop and check. So it says think. Aside from being the first successful English colony in America, what other firsts can be traced back to Jamestown? So Jamestown was the first colony in North America, but what other things did Jamestown do first? So let's think back to their relationship with the Powhatans. So the Jamestown colony was one of the first colonies to actually have a good working relationship with the Native Americans. Another thing was they were the first people to have slaves in North America. And another thing was what we just read about was they were the first ones to really have like a representative government set up in North America. So Jamestown had the first representative government, they had the first slaves, and they had the first relationships with the Native Americans.